Antony and Cleopatra is set up here, ready to start the game. We have quite a large map. It's fully 8 sheets of A4 when you print it off, which probably equates to around about a 28 by 32 inch map. So it's a full-size map sheet, which is quite nice to see in a game that you can print and play like I've done here. We have 2 sides. There's what's known as the Western player and the Eastern player. The Eastern player is in blue, and they represent the 2 halves of the Roman Empire during the period a few decades after the demise of Julius Caesar. And this game is actually Mark Antony and Cleopatra fighting against Octavian, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, who would eventually become Augustus. And that right there is all I know about this particular part of history. It's not an era that I typically play, so forgive me in advance if I do get some of these place names and people and events horribly wrong as I'm going through this. But let's focus on the game. The game is clearly set in and around the Mediterranean, the eastern half of the Mediterranean, sort of from Italy and the Carthage there in North Africa, all the way over to the Middle East and Judea and Syria. And now some of the map is underneath that player aid here. I'll remove that in a moment to show you the rest of the map, but the player aid is just there to show you some of the components in addition to what's on here, and they will have 2 player aids, 1 for each side, plus some cards, which I'll go through in a moment. We have also some tokens, which are a part of the game, some administrative type tokens. There are some cubes that are not part of the game, but I use them to represent where on the map these cards are. Just a personal thing that I like to do to help me identify places quickly. And a cup of tea, which, although not an essential part of the game, is something that I do like to have with me as well when I play. Okay, let's remove that player aid and take a look at what you do in a game of Antony and Cleopatra. The map is revealed, and we can now go into how to actually play Antony and Cleopatra. But before I go into what we actually do on any one turn, because there's quite a few ins and outs, it'd be worth having a quick look at the different tracks, because they're extremely important in this game and they influence a great many things that are to follow in this video. And the first one to look at is the round track, or the game structure, if you like. And it's set into a number of years. There are 3 years in total. Each one of those years is a number of months, or a month and a half, I believe it is, in terms of scale. You will move, each sort of month and a half represents a full turn. So you'll start here in 32 BCE and basically play through until you reach 30 BCE, turn number 7. And that's important. It might sound obvious that you'd play through until the game ends, but it's important because certain things are going to happen later in the game, depending on where you are in other tracks, particularly the prestige track, and where you are in terms of the months and the seasons. So, for example, we have winter bookending the track, and we also have summer, and that will be a sign that you need to do attrition checks and things like that. And there will also be sort of certain modifiers that you get based on where you are on that track as well. And of course, the game could end before you reach the last turn of 30 BCE if you defeat your opponent outright. And the way that you could do that is through the prestige track. The prestige track is this one in the bottom left corner. It's two-tone, and the reason it's two-tone is because you have high prestige and then low prestige in green afterwards. Where you are on that prestige track will influence what you do on your turn in terms of additional phases, whether you can cause defections on the other player, and various other things. And of course, if you get to 0, you lose. It's a very important track, and prestige is gained through combat, through forcing strength point losses, and various other things, which I'll get to when the time comes. But suffice to say, this track is very important for the turn structure, much like the turn order and year track is. In the top right corner there, just over there, we have the resource point track, and that is used to identify how many resources you're gaining from the different areas that you control. And now that I've put these little cubes on, you can sort of see the geographical spread of the territories that each side controls, with at the beginning of the game, blue controlling far more. Only certain provinces give resources, and only in certain circumstances, which I'll get to when we look at the resource phase. But you would use those resources to buy replacements and reinforcements. Again, get to those later. The other thing you can do as the Western player only, so as Octavian only, is you can use this track here, which is the off-map garrison track. And that's very important because that allows you to get additional reinforcements from elsewhere in the Western Roman Empire. And also it's a source of some frustration, because should you choose to get some of those garrisons from elsewhere in your empire, you may come under trouble elsewhere in the empire, and you need to divert resources to deal with that trouble. And that would only be the Western player that would do that. Also on the map, we have a couple of places where, and again this is relating to the prestige track, where Illyrians and Dacians, and over here Parthians, could come in and cause problems on different parts of the empire as a whole. And again, that may not happen depending on where you are on the prestige track. Let's have a look at the turn structure then of Antony Cleopatra. As I said, we have a number of years, each with a number of turns. Within each of these turns, so each of these sort of month and a half represented by those eight boxes there, you have a number of phases. The first phase is what's called the random event phase, which is where storms might happen and the Parthians, for example, might invade. Then you have one player's turn, and that turn will be broken down into 4 or 5 steps, depending on which player you are, and then the other player will have their turn before finally moving on after both players have had their turn, and then you repeat that process again from the storm check phase, or the event phase. Each player has a slightly different phase, and my printer hasn't printed that well, but we can see here for the Western player we have 5: reinforcements, defection, movement, trouble, combat, and attrition. The Eastern player, the blue player, doesn't have the troubles phase. That's only applicable to the Western player, and it will only happen when off-map garrisons are less than a certain number. And equally, the defection phase, phase B there, will only happen if a player is 5 prestige points or more higher than the opponent, and the opponent has low prestige, so is in the green part of that box there, which we can come to in a moment. But how the game fits together is really key to how it plays. And the first thing you do when anyone turn is the random events phase, which is a storm check and possibly an invasion check. Before you do either of those things though, you need to calculate who has got the most territory. And this is a slightly quirky thing, because you do the same thing for resource points in the reinforcements phase, but you also do it here, and the person who has the most valid resource points, and I'll come to what is a valid resource point when we do the reinforcement phase, but the person with the most valid resource points decides who goes first, and that's very important. And in this case, with the Eastern player, the blue player, having so many more territories at the start of the game, they do go first. Oh wait, they don't necessarily go first, they get to decide who goes first. And you do that before checking for storms or for invasions. How do you check for a storm? Well, quite simply, you roll the dice. If you roll a 6, you need to then check for a storm. However, if it is summer, you need to roll a slightly different number than if it is winter. Summer and spring being the green boxes over on the year track, which is over here, and winter being the blue boxes. If it's winter, when you roll a 6, you have to roll on a storm table, and that storm table is here, and it's a simple die roll, one die roll of 6. Depending on what you roll, various calamities may or may not happen to your navy. Of course, if it is not winter, you need to roll again, and if you roll a 5 or a 6 on the second roll, then you have to roll on that storm table. So storms are much more likely in winter, and both players do that before you check for anything else during the turn. It's a slightly unusual thing. You decide who goes first, then both players do something. So how do you check for invasions? Again, similar thing. You roll a die, but this time there's a sort of like a caveat to when you do it, and that caveat is that you must have 18 prestige points or less. So both players have to be here or lower on the green part of the prestige track. Otherwise you skip the invasion check altogether. When you roll the die for invasions, you on a roll of a 1, and depending where players are on this track, it's either a roll of a 1 or a 1 or a 2. You'll then roll for what they call revenge, and depending on what happens, either the Illyrians or the Parthians will turn up, and they will, when I find the counter, they will basically be a pain for the player who controls that region. And you probably just about see that at the top of the map there where I've placed the counter. They are really a kind of a blocking mechanism more than anything else. They just sort of sit mostly. I won't go into the exact rules for all of them because they don't happen that often. The times I've played this, they've happened maybe once or twice. And you kind of have to fight your way past them essentially because they're right in the way if you're trying to get to Rome via the land route. So that is the random events check. You decide who goes first based on territories controlled, then you roll for storms, then you roll for invasions, and then it becomes the first player's turn. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to assume the Western player is going first, because it allows me to show all of the possible things that might happen in a turn, whereas not all of these things happen for the Eastern player. So the first thing you'll do is you'll do the reinforcement phase. And the reinforcement phase is where you count resources gathered from your territories. Now, on the map you have amphora. I'm not sure if you can see that when out of focus. You have a little amphora next to some of the territories on the map. Not all of them, but some. And each of those amphora is equivalent to a resource point, and you add them up and you place them on the resource point track in the top left corner. The Western player only will also gain some resources for the off-map garrisons right at the very top there, if you can see that. So this point in the game, right at the very first turn, there will be 8 resource points for the Western player for on-map resources, plus an additional 2 for the off-map garrisons, and the fact that there's no trouble in the off-map garrisons. As soon as there's trouble, you may start to lose those bonus resources. We'll get to trouble in a moment. how do reinforcements work? Well, there's reinforcements and then there's replacements. Reinforcements are these counters here and these counters here. Replacements will be units that have been destroyed or eliminated, and then they go in this box. But these reinforcements, they can come on in the first turn, they sort of sit on the player aid, and you can place them on the map, one counter per turn, starting from the very first turn. So really, realistically, that means only 4 of those will go on in the first year, and you'll have the rest available after that. So the reinforcements only, not these ones, but these ones, they have a set point of entry. And for the Western player, that is this hex here, up in the corner. They can only come on there. There's also the point where you can bring on those off-map garrisons, or send units to the off-map garrison. The Eastern player has a little bit more flexibility in their first turn reinforcements, in that they can come on fairly liberally in this region here. Replacements are the units that are built during the game. If you somehow manage to have no casualties by 31 BCE, these units here will go straight to the replacement box. Otherwise, casualties will come to the replacements in order to be rebuilt, with the exception of experienced legions. I haven't got to the differences between the counters yet, but that's coming. Suffice to say, the experienced legions, which are the ones with the dot here, they cannot be rebuilt. But there's an exception, which is why I haven't got to the units yet. And when it's your turn, the resource points that you have gathered, so those 10 resource points, that would be the Western players' resources in this first turn, can be used to build units from this box based on the number of points there. And given that the cheapest unit is 6 resource points, and the average, I suppose, resource from any one region is 2, units are expensive and hard to come by in this game. When you do build resource replacements, you can place them far more freely than you can do the reinforcements. It's a subtle distinction, reinforcements and replacements, but it's really important. Remember, for the Western player, reinforcements can only come on here. However, replacements can go anywhere on the board where they have a region or a territory that they control that is able to generate resources, even if that resource value is 0. So what I mean by that is, let's say, for example, we have these 2 units here in Africa. That is a controlled region or province controlled by the Western Empire, and they can be used, or that entire region can be used to place a replacement. If there is a Eastern player's set of units, that's okay. You can still put reinforcements there or replacements there as the Western player. However, if you were to take away those units, perhaps put them in Sicily, all of a sudden, even though the Western players still control Africa, the Eastern players' units prevent resources being generated, which in turn prevent any replacement units being put in that region. And this concept of a controlled area not giving the controlling player resources due to the presence of enemy units is very important, because the control of the area does not go to the opponent except and unless there is a defection phase, which we'll come to shortly. The reason why I said even if that resource value is 0, you can place units is because there are plenty of places on the map. For example, Cyrenaica here, which is in this case owned by the Eastern player. No amphora, no resources. Its resource value is 0. However, you can, if you were the blue player, place reinforcement or replacements there. And you can see I muddle up these things quite easily, so it's something that trips me up quite a lot. Replacements can go here. However, if there was a enemy unit there and no friendly unit, you couldn't then place a replacement. I hope that made sense. It's quite a subtle distinction that threw me for a little bit. Once the reinforcement phase is done, and only if you are 5 resource points higher than your opponent, so let's say we are at a situation where blue is on 18 and red's on 24, let's just pretend that's 5, then you can then do what's known as a defection, or the defection phase happens. And this is where the acting player can target either a unit or group of units or a province and roll on a table to determine whether or not that province or unit defects. This is quite important because it's a way to take units away from a region without necessarily getting into combat, so it's far safer than trying to go into combat. Or it's a way of gaining extra resource points, and it's the only way a province will change hands. So Africa will stay the Western player's province until such time as the blue player can force a defection. How does that work? Well, same as much else in this game, you roll on the table, and depending on what you roll, depends on what happens. You may have no result, the opponent may choose, or the target may defect. For the troops, same thing, depending on what you roll, depends on what happens on the board. Modifiers apply, but they are different depending on whether you're doing a roll for a troop defection or a province defection. And there are far more modifiers for troop defection than there are for provinces. And basically it's modified by things like whether the acting player has high prestige themselves, whether the target is out of supply, whether there are any leaders anywhere, whether there's plague, or whether there is any die roll modifier provided by a leader, which I'll get to again when we do the units. So that's quite a powerful thing, but it will only happen when at least one player has low prestige and there's a gap of 5 prestige minimum between the person who's trying to cause the defection and the opponent. And then, having done that, we can move on to movement. Now, movement is pretty straightforward. We haven't really looked at any of the counters yet because, to be honest, there's not a huge amount of difference between any of them, and I'll just highlight some of the key differences really, because basically when you look at them, and here I'm just using some of the ships just as an example. These are squadrons. There's no factors on there. There's no unit IDs or anything like that on there. Very straightforward. Heavy squadrons, or the black ones, give a benefit when you come to retreat in a combat if you're fighting against certain numbers of light squadrons, which are the white ones, and vice versa. So we'll get into that when we get into combat. But there's very little difference between most of these units. In terms of the ships, the big difference, I suppose, out of all the ships is the transports. The fact that these can carry certain other units, and we have leaders who I'll get to shortly, and the different types of legions who are, if I can find one, simply identified by the fact as to whether they have a black spot on them or not. Black spots are experienced legions. Those without a black spot, like this one here, are regular or inexperienced legions. And that's quite an important distinction, which we will come to when we come to the combat. So anyway, how do all these different things move? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Leaders move 6 hexes. That's fine. Squadrons can also move up to 6, but they can only go along coastal hexes. And coastal hexes are the ones that share a hex with land, so water and land on the same hex. So for example, this is a coastal hex because we have water and land, and it basically goes all the way around. And squadrons cannot go on land itself, so they couldn't, for example, decide they wanted to go on this square here or this hex here, and they can't go on the sea, and the sea is this water without any land. The only units that can go on the sea are the leaders and the transport ships. Now, transport ships have problems. Now they can go 9, so if they were to just go around the coastline, they would just go 9. And they can pick up and drop off other units. So for example, Cleopatra and an experienced legion could both jump on a transport and be carried along. You could perhaps drop off Cleopatra somewhere and drop off the legion a few hexes later, so long as you don't go over that 9 hex movement limit for the transport. That limit of movement is modified if the unit itself that's boarding the transport has made any movement, and it's basically cut by a third, or loses 3 for each of each hex the land unit moves. However, when it comes to the sea, you have to stop and you have to roll for storms. This is not the same as a storm check at the beginning of the game. Basically, as you're crossing the deep ocean, it's dangerous, it's risky, and you need to roll a die and apply some modifiers. And we have here the storm sea movement hazard table, but suffice to say there's a number of modifiers that will affect that table, and the higher the die roll, the more likelihood of something bad happening. But what are those modifiers? Well, the main one really is movement and how many of these sea hexes you move across. So a ship here, perhaps it's got a legion on it, will move like so, and then it will roll a die, and you'll count how many hexes you intend to move through and apply that as a die roll modifier. So if you were to go from something like that, you'd apply a +1 modifier for the sea movement. If you were to go like that, there'd be a +2, and if for some strange reason you wanted to go like that, it would be 3. And there are other things, for example, if there are pirates and so on, but that's the main one. And obviously, if you do hit a storm, there's a reasonable chance that you'll lose your units, including the ones that are travelling with the transport. So that's not really the best thing to do, having unnecessary die roll modifiers through lengthy sea journeys. Okay, so sea units are on the coast except transports. Leaders can go on land or on sea. They don't need to wait for a ship. They can swim, I guess. Units that are on land, so these are the legions, the cavalry, the supply units, they are limited to 3 hexes that have land. So even though there's water on this hex, it's the coast, they can go on the land side of the hex because there's land there. What they can't do is go across any water regions of the coast. For example, they can't go from, if I just move some of these counters out of the way, making a right mess here, they can't go from Athens to the Asian coastline like that. Not possible. You need to jump on a transport and be ferried across by transport. Otherwise, it's just three spaces. There are some terrain modifiers for supply units and cavalry, which basically means they have a modifier if they go through the more mountainous, rough terrain regions. Really not very many if you're used to playing war games. I think that's pretty much it for the units. There really isn't much between them, as I said. Leaders provide a buff, but they provide a buff in combat. So let's look at combat next, and we'll get more into the leaders and the differences between legions and experienced legions. Normally, after movement, if you were the eastern player, so the blue side, you would just move straight into combat. However, for the western player, there's an additional phase called the Troubles phase, and this relates to that off-map garrison track up there. Appreciate it's a little bit far away, but it's kind of upside down. It's just the unfortunate nature of the way my table's set up at the moment. And what the Troubles phase is represents problems elsewhere in the Roman Empire, and Rome is trying to keep its grip on the European world while at the same time as fighting this civil war. And it only happens, the Troubles phase that is, it only happens when there are less than 8 garrisons off map. The track starts at 8 and then it goes down, and if you haven't paid for an off map garrison as part of your replacements phase, you can buy an experienced legion from off map using the activate experienced legion function. As the Western player, you can't buy experienced legions any other way. You would add a experienced legion to your map, and then you would move the track down. But if you are still less than 8 garrisons when the Troubles phase rolls around, you will move these counters. Now these counters are calm and secure, or they start calm and secure. The first time you have a challenge, you flip over one of them. The second time you flip over another, and they are rebellion and invasion. And when they are on the secure and calm side, each one of those tokens provides a resource point, which is where those 2 additional resource points come from when you do the replacements phase. However, when they are on the invasion and rebellion sides, there are no resources, and so while it's quite nice for the Western player to take as many off-map garrisons as you like, these experienced legions, that have been toughened through years of fighting in Europe and Britannia, for example, they do leave your borders less secure and therefore less likely to get resources from elsewhere. So that's the Troubles phase. You can try and increase that by fighting an off-map battle, which again relates to rolling dice and checking tables and so on. It's pretty straightforward. It's not really complex enough for me to go into at the moment, but suffice to say, you will move that track back up should you win one of those die roll events during the Troubles phase. Combat happens then, and combat is interesting. There are no modifiers on any of the counters, remember, and every single unit in the game, with the exception of supply units, transports and leaders, gives you 1 strength point. And when it comes to counting a strength point, you simply count the number of units you have in a stack, excluding those transports, leaders and supply units. However, and there's always a however, if you have the experienced legions, they are worth 2 strength points each for the purposes of the strength point total. However, should you suffer losses, they only count as 1 strength point in terms of losses. It's a little bit tricksy, that's that rule. So for example, that stack here would be 7 because we have 3 experienced legions plus a cavalry. I've just realised how slanty that counter is. So we'd have 7 strength points. If they were to take 3 strength point losses, even though these counters here are worth 2 each, you'd have to remove 3 counters, because in combat they only count for, in combat losses they only count for 1 strength point. So in attack and defence it's 2, as losses it's just 1. But how does combat work? Well, as with the majority of other things in the game, there's a table, you roll the die and see what happens. Now in this case, let's pretend for a moment we're on the land, and land units can attack land units, sea units attack sea units. However, there are some elements of the naval combat where you can add land unit strength to sea unit strength, which we'll get to in a moment. But let's do a land unit battle first. And here we'll say Antony is attacking this group of legionnaires and cavalry here. You'd add up the relative strength points and sizes of each of those stacks. So here we have 1, that's 3, 5, 6, 10, 12, 14. You can only have a maximum of 12 strength points in a combat. So let's move one to one side just for a moment. He's not struggling in the sea there, he's actually just off to one side. Leaders do not count for strength points. But we have 12 versus 7, which is going to be a strength point ratio of 2 to 1. And you'd roll on the 2 to 1 column. Now, this is where leaders come in. Leaders, for example, Antony and his equivalent, Octavian, will give a positive modifier on the column for their side. So if they're defending, they get a positive shift, equally if they are attacking. So we are on the 2 to 1. With the presence of Antony, we move to 3 to 1. And then we roll the die, which we've rolled a 6. And in this game, the higher numbers are the least good. And here we have rolled on the 3 to 1 a question mark. Now, had we rolled any other number, we would have had 2 columns, the attacker and the defender, and the numbers represent a percentage losses plus whether they're eliminated or retreat. And the percentage losses are explained further here, but because we rolled a question mark, each side in turn would have to roll a die again. So the Western player has rolled a 6, which is a 60R, which means there is 60% losses plus a retreat. They had 7 strength points. You roll it over to 60R, which means we lose 4 of them, which in this case they are actually eliminated because we've only got four counters there, remembering those experienced legions count for 1 strength point when they're defeated in combat. And the blue player would now roll. They've rolled a 5, meaning a 43% losses, and they had 12, which means 5 of those counters are removed, or up to the value of 5. So it would be 5 counters. And then, because the counter was cleared, they have the option to move in as kind of an advance after combat. Naval combat works in much the same way, with a couple of exceptions, and you can, in any combat, you can do what's called a retreat before combat, where you roll a die, and on a 1 to 4 you can retreat as the defender, 5 to 6 you can't. But the reason I'm showing it more particularly with the sea combat is because those squadrons, the difference between the light and the heavy squadron, a light squadron, if they're escaping from heavy squadrons, have a positive modifier to the die roll. Heavy squadrons attempting to escape from light squadrons have again another modifier. Otherwise it works basically the same. You count them up and roll the die on a different table. It's still a combat table with the same kind of structure, but it's a naval combat table rather than a land combat table, and then apply any losses. Now the reason I'm showing kind of combat here is we have Cleopatra, and Cleopatra's ability is unique amongst the 4 leaders, and that in her case, if she's on a squadron, one of the squadrons counts as her own personal vessel, isn't included in combat, and if they are defeated, can retreat with her. So that's quite a neat benefit. Should you have a land unit nearby and you want to contribute some strength points, you can contribute a certain number of strength points to the combat along the coastline, so long as you have more than 1 squadron. So for example here you could only have 1 of those those legions in the combat along the coastline. When you retreat 1 hex. For the attacker, retreat is voluntary. For the defender, retreat is mandatory. If units are eliminated, and this is quite an interesting thing, depending on what unit they either go to the replacements box or, in the case of experienced legions, out of the game. And you cannot rebuild experienced legions for either side unless the Western player chooses to bring some from of those off-map garrisons. The final thing you do on your turn, and both players do this, but on their turn only, and only during winter, summer, or any turn where there is 19 strength points between the two sides in any one hex. Yes, it's a bit complicated. You need to check for attrition, and attrition is a die roll. If you fail the die roll, you have things like plague or losses due to hunger and so on. It's a fairly simple, sort of straightforward. Roll a d6, apply the result depending on your strength points. But the reason we're focusing on it a little bit is the concept of supply. And it's quite an interesting concept here in the game. Supply is only really checked for a couple of times in a turn, and that is during attrition and defection possibly. But during the attrition, you have to supply, if you have more than 3 strength points in a hex. So, for example, here we have more than 3, and we need to check to see who amongst the units we're doing an attrition check for is in supply. And here we have a straight line to Alexandria, which is the blue player's supply point. Rome is the Western player's supply point. We are in supply, so that's fine. Now, because we can draw a line of hexes that the units can legally go to. Now, this group of units here, and I've just realised there's one too few. If we had to do a attrition check here to this group of units in Crete, they cannot legally get to Alexandria. There's a unit in the way. There's no land bridge across these hexes to get to Alexandria. Therefore, they are out of supply, which is quite bad in terms of the die roll modifier. But it's where these units come in, these supply units. You take them off the board in order to be in supply. So it's quite useful, but they're very, very limited in number. There's only one in the entire game per side. They're quite expensive to buy, and if you place one in an area, you cannot then place it back in that area should it get destroyed and you need to rebuild it. Not in the same turn, at least. Okay, that is most of the major things you need to know. There are lots of little things in the game. I think the only thing I haven't really covered are fortresses, which add a defensive strength point modifier. I also haven't mentioned a few hexes like this one here, where there are certain funny movement rules where you have to go around the entire peninsula rather than jumping from one side to the other. The only other thing I haven't mentioned then is how to actually boost and reduce prestige. And again, this is a little rule that takes a little bit of getting used to. If you occupy an enemy's capital, which is either Alexandria or Rome, depending on which side you're on, you gain a strength point, or you lose a strength point, depending on which side you're on, and that happens once. The first time. If you win a battle against an enemy force of between 2 and 4 strength points, and that unit or that force is forced to retreat or it's eliminated, and you yourself don't suffer an elimination or retreat result, you will also gain strength points. Also 5+, you gain slightly more strength points if you win against a force of 5+. And also for the Western player, when a trouble happens, you also lose prestige. I'm conscious that it sounds like there's a tremendous number of little rules in the game and there's a potential for it to be fairly slow, but that's not the case. And so what I'll do is I'll play through the initial event phase and the first player turn just to show you how the game does flow quite nicely, particularly in its earlier phases and when certain things will happen and when certain things won't happen. So we're going to start the game right from the very beginning with the year 32 BCE, and it is currently May. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do the random event phase, and that's going to first require the players to tally up all their areas and how many resources the areas give them, and the player with the most is going to decide who goes first. Now, the resources are also printed on these cards, and I know as the blue player, the Eastern Empire has 14, and the Western player with its cards plus the resources from a lack of trouble elsewhere in the Empire has only 10. The blue player decides who goes first. Now, the blue player could go first, or as I'm going to do here, I'm going to let the red player or the western half of the empire go first. Having decided that, we need to check for storms. We are in May, so that's not high summer, it's not winter, obviously. So I'm going to roll the die, and on a 6, we may need to roll it again. We haven't rolled a 6, so we don't need to worry about storms this particular part of the game. If I try and shuffle the camera over slightly, just see the prestige track here. We are both on 27 prestige, and so the next part of the game, which is the invasion check, we don't need to do. That happens later, usually in 31 BCE, based on my experiences, is when you start having to do the invasion check. And so then it moves on to the red player, the western player's turn, because the turn was handed over to that player by the person with the most resource points. And this is where we begin to actually use those resource points, as I mentioned in the overview. And we know we had 8 for the on-map territories, plus another 2. We have 2 resource points for the lack of trouble. Now, I can't really buy anything at this point, but here is where you would normally buy your replacements. But because this is the first turn in the game, the reinforcements can come on. Now, the reinforcements are taken from the box over here, 1 unit at a time, and I think I like the idea of having an experienced legion. And that experienced legion, as the western player, would need to come on just there. Replacements that begin to come in once you start to lose casualties, so from around potentially turn 2, potentially turn 3, they can be placed anywhere you have resources. And we move on to defection. Again, trying to shuffle my camera slightly to see the track. Both players are in high prestige currently, which is the kind of the pink colour, and both players are the same. Both high prestige for both players, and having less than 5 difference between them means the defection phase does not happen at this point. And again, defections typically start happening a little bit later on. So we can go straight to movement. Now, as the western player, I need to think about what I'm going to do. I can go around. Let's just move that. That's not relevant at the moment. I can go around, go through Illyricum into Macedonia, or I could take my transports and come this way. I could try to go straight for Athens, where Antony and Cleopatra currently are, but I suspect, given there's a stack of heavy squadrons and experienced legions under there, I may not wish to do that straight away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move some of my soldiers from Rome to Carthage. Now, currently, stacked in with Octavian are some units that currently garrison the fortress, so they can't move. But then we do have 2 experienced legions plus Octavian himself. And what they're going to do is they're going to jump on transports. We have a couple of transports there currently with Agrippa, and these two transports are going to take 1 legion each, and one of them can carry Octavian. And so they can move 9. We got onto the transport in the same hex that we started, so the transports can move 9. And what I can do is I can move around the coast hexes, dropping off as I see fit. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And that's where that movement's going to stop. Land units in Carthage, they might move as well. 1, 2, 3. In the hope that we can come this way and cause problems in Alexandria. Agrippa, meanwhile, is on some light squadrons. So these light squadrons are going to come with Agrippa, and they're going to come to this area here to act as a deterrent against Mark Antony and Cleopatra crossing the Adriatic Sea. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just outside Terentium there, and we're also going to bring the same sort of units down here, again to try and act as a deterrent against Mark Antony's forces coming that way. The units up the top, we can also move 3. Probably best to keep them together. And that's all the movement I want to do. So the movement phase is done. There's no zone of control or anything like that to worry about, so we can go straight to the Troubles phase as the Western player. Now the Troubles phase simply, in the first instance, requires checking how many off-map garrisons there are. If there are 8, we skip. So we skip. There aren't 8. We don't need to worry about that phase. And we move into combat. There's no combat at the moment, and therefore we move to attrition. But we are in May, so there is no need to worry about any attrition. That is the entirety of the Western player's turn. And so we'll now move over to the Eastern player, who follows a similar process, looks at reinforcements and so on. They have 14 resource points, but again, can't buy anything at this point in the game, but they can take a legion from their first turn reinforcements and place it in this area here. Next thing they're going to do is they will then move to Defection. Again, the track, slightly off camera now, is not at a point where you can do that phase. Moving on into movement. And let us see what we've got there. Okay, so Cleopatra is with some squadrons and some transports. Antony is with some legions. And I think what we'll do is we will again put some of these guys onto those transports. We will move all 3 transports at the same time, each with a legion, and then we will move them. Now, what we're going to do, we could attack here. That's perfectly feasible. We could go around 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We couldn't actually get into combat this turn, but what we could do is we could come across here and act as a deterrent for Octavian's forces that are coming down the coastline. And I think that is what we'll do. But remember, if we go straight across the sea, we have to roll for sea troubles. Now remember, that is involving a roll on the table, and I'll roll the die. I've rolled a 3. I do need a +1 for the sea, and then I can cross over, taking note of what happened when I crossed the sea. When I crossed the sea, I rolled a 3. I add 1 for the fact I moved 1 sea hex. There was no challenge or no effect there, and I now move onto the coastline, where I will drop off those soldiers, and then I will move the transports out the way a little bit, just in case they are in range of any of the Western player's ships next turn. I don't really want to do any more movement other than that as the Eastern player. So we will move to combat. There's no combat currently, so we will then move to attrition. It's not a winter or summer turn again, and there's no hex with greater than 19, and so we move straight into the next turn when we begin again. So hopefully that quick run through of the first turn there gives you a feel for how the game plays when everything's put together. There is quite a lot of little bits in the game, but the way they come in at different times means that the game moves far more quickly than you might imagine when you look at each individual bit in turn. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope that it has proved a useful rule summary if you're looking to play the game yourself, or an interesting overview of the game if you're considering checking it out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to carry on my game that I've started here, and I will probably film a couple of after turn action reports over the coming days as I play it a little bit at a time in the evenings. That's it from me for this video then. Please do think about clicking like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I do hope that I'll see you next time.